I'll start with I'll start with a quick introduction and cover what we're going to be talking about here. So I am Tom Leddy. I'm a technical architect director at Salesforce. I've been at Salesforce for almost 7 years since actually next week will be my 7 year anniversary. I started in 2018. Have been in a variety of different roles since I was at Salesforce. So I started out at salesforce.org actually, and I was an architect that was working primarily with nonprofits and schools. For a little while, moved over to the well-architected team, and I was one of the people that helped to create the well-architected framework. And then recently, this year, moved back to we call it the public sector team, but it's basically I'm doing architecture work with, again, schools and nonprofits, and then also government agencies over in the U.S. So, but a lot of experience in architecture. Even before I was at Salesforce, I had been an enterprise architect for several years and working with very large organizations to build solutions. And what we're going to be talking about here are some architecture, like foundational architecture information, and how to use those concepts to build healthy solutions. So we will get started with our favorite forward-looking statement slide. I would be love to hear if anybody hasn't seen this slide from Salesforce. But basically, since I am a Salesforce employee, I have to make sure to tell you to make any purchasing decisions based on whatever's actually for sale. If you talk to your AE, and not on anything that I say during this session. A little bit about me. I kind of mentioned who I am and my background as an architect. So. One of the things that I want to talk about, though, so good architecture is the foundation of every successful implementation. In fact, the interesting story, if you notice, the trailhead character for architects is Ruth the elephant, and the reason, if anybody hasn't heard this story before, but the reason it's an elephant is because architecture is always the elephant in the room in any conversation, and you need to be thinking about architecture as it's foundational and things. We'll talk a little bit about AI and Agent Force in this session. It's not specifically about AI, so I'm not going to go too deep into it. But the reality is, you need to make sure that you've got a strong architectural foundation in place to enable some of these latest and greatest features that are available on the platform as well. Especially, if you want your agents to work correctly and have the right data that they need. So the things to think about with Salesforce, the capabilities of the platform are broad and deep. And if anybody, I'm guessing there's a lot of people with a lot of experience on the call. I know I see a few names that I recognize here. Saw Blanca, saw, Kid, and if you've been working with the platform for a long time, you probably remember a time when it was just Sales Cloud or maybe just Service Cloud. And if you go back far enough, there were times when you couldn't even create custom objects yet. Obviously, a lot's changed now. And if you think about all of the tools that we have, the capabilities to integrate, we just acquired another company. We just announced it yesterday. And the different industry clouds, and we've added, Service Cloud, Marketing, all these other capabilities. So you can go really broad on the platform, and depending on the type of organization you're working with, you can actually use Salesforce to implement, to automate a very significant portion of your organization's tasks. But then you can also pick specific areas of the platform and go, really, really deep. So, sales is a good example. If you think about all of the different features that are available for sales reps, there's a lot of horizontal architecture to be thinking about there as well. And then there are multiple ways to solve any problem. I'm guessing that if you've been working with the platform even for a short time, you've kind of figured this out, that there are every time you have a problem, the biggest challenge isn't whether or not you can actually solve it on the platform, but what is the actual best approach to solve it? And, in your specific scenario, which approaches are better than others? And, I put this other sub bullet point here that if you're implementing AI and you've got kind of a mix of spaghetti where you've got a bunch of different data sources, and they're not all connected, and you don't really have that full picture of your constituents or your customers. AI is going to be a lot more difficult to implement because it's not going to have the information that like an agent would need to actually do its job. So you need to be thinking about that underlying architecture and potentially remediating technical debt before you try and go ahead and move forward with an AI implementation. And one of the biggest challenges is, it's not even just that there's multiple ways to solve a problem, not even just that there's all these different things you can do with the platform. It's that it's not always easy to know if you're making the right decisions in the first place, right? There are a lot of things that you can be doing that look like they're the right, short-term answer to a problem, and then you look back 6 months later and say, "Oh man, I wish I wouldn't have done that. I need to rethink this, and I need to rethink the entire pattern." And well, I'm actually going to show some of those patterns and give some examples in a few minutes. But the first thing I'd like to do, so there is a chat available. I would love to hear a little bit more about everybody's role in your at your current organization. So I'd be curious to know how many architects we have, and how many people are in roles that maybe they don't have the title of architect, but they're doing architect type work. And if there are any developers, feel free to use the chat and share your answers. Innovation architect. All right, architects. Architects. Oh, Manuel, nice to see you. Yeah, architects, technical architect. Okay, so we are actually mostly architects so far, and then a senior developer. That honestly, I think a senior developer, you're probably, you even if you're not an architect, you have to be aware of the underlying architecture if you're developing. So a lot of solution architects. Awesome. All right. Um, and one of the other interesting things that I'm seeing is there's architects, people are putting their titles as architect, a solution architect, CTO is another one that's like an executive version of an architect. And, the question is, who is an architect, right? And how can an architect actually help with an implementation? So if you're an architect, you're wearing all of these different hats, right? You're doing solution design, but you're also managing stakeholders, and some of those stakeholders are, executive leaders at a business. You're providing delivery leadership, and you're providing, that leadership for the implementation team, where even if you're doing more of the upfront design work, but you're not actually doing hands-on work, you still need to understand what the people that are doing that hands-on work are doing so that you can provide that leadership and think about how any changes are going to impact the projects that you're working on. You're also handling governance and change management. Yeah, there are resources that usually do that on a team, but you're still kind of overseeing that and making sure that anyone that's doing change management understands the implications of what it is that you're implementing. And then there's also road mapping and strategy that kind of goes hand in hand with the stakeholder management. If you're thinking about you're working with like executive stakeholders at a business, and you're talking about long and short-term roadmaps where Salesforce fits into a landscape, what systems you might be able to replace with Salesforce, what capabilities it brings that an organization doesn't currently have, and what is that going to look like in the immediate future, and then further out up to maybe 24 months out. So architects, they're kind of a mix of trusted advisors, technical influencers, and then also experienced practitioners. I think we all know that you're not gonna have the title of architect with just a few months of experience on the platform. It's something that you get for after being here for a while, and there's a variety of different certifications. Maybe you have them, maybe you don't, but the that long-term experience of working with the platform and really understanding how it works under the hood is what you're really going to get to be an architect. So let's get into some of the foundational concepts. So the first thing we're going to want to do is protect our stakeholders, right? We've had a long-standing saying at Salesforce that trust is our number one value, and that actually should be the first thing you think about when you're thinking about your architecture. So security, things like authentication. So how do you make sure that the users that are accessing your system know, that who they are, and then that they're authorized to do the right things when they actually get access to your system, and that they can access the right data. And then things like session security as well. So making sure that, people are not like hijacking your sessions for, that you don't have hackers hijacking sessions, for example, and that you're actually protecting your users in ways that they don't even realize they may need to be protecting themselves. And then below that, there's data security, which is where we talk about number one, there's record access, but there's also things like encryption, and then even having the right backups and restore strategy and the right archiving strategy. All of those things can impact your architecture. So you should be thinking about all of those topics as well. Kind of the next level that goes sort of hand in hand with security is complying with local regulations. And I know in the EU, it's easy to think about GDPR, but there's other, country by country locations that you might need to be considering. A lot of countries are coming up with data residency laws recently. There's also localization. So, do you want to make sure that that whatever languages and cultures are going to be using your system are protected or are represented? Um, Ethical standards. So, there's the legal requirements that might be specific to your organization, your region, your industry. And then there's also the additional ethics that you specifically might want to apply on top of that. And I specifically call it AI because when we think about AI and different types of hallucinations and access to different data and sharing data with an LLM, for example, there's things that you're going to want to put as standards around that. Accessibility as well is another one that honestly often gets overlooked. But when you think about who's going to be using your system, you want to think that, does everybody have the same abilities? Do they have, is there somebody that you need that might be colorblind, especially if you've got something that's a website that's exposed publicly? Do people have any, cognitive impairments that you need to be aware of? And actually, I saw that Marie Van Roekel is joined, so I want to give a quick shout out because I know she's going to be doing an entire presentation on accessibility at an event that's coming up as well. So definitely worth checking that one out. And then reliability. Now, this is where we start to get into some of the concepts that are more traditional technical architecture that people think about. So, is your system available? Is it performing well? Does it scale? Are you modeling your data the right way? Are you able to handle large volumes of data? Availability is probably one of the most interesting ones to me because we've always assumed that, well, that's, of course, that's Salesforce's responsibility, right? It's you've got the platform and, where we guarantee a certain amount of uptime, and we've got the trust.salesforce.com website. And I would say that's true to a point. Availability is actually a shared responsibility. And as an architect, you need to be thinking through this. So the common scenario that I've given it to people in the past is, what if you have somebody, what if you give all of your users system admin access, somebody gets fired, and then they decide that before they leave, they're going to log into your org because you don't have SSO or turned on, or they haven't been deactivated yet or whatever. And then they go in and deactivate every user and then go and delete a bunch of data, and then they leave the company. Well, at that point, your system's not going to be, even though the platform is available, your specific system is not going to be available. And so you need to be thinking about, then it ties back to, security and seeing how these different topics are related to, make sure that you can avoid a scenario like that. So, and the next thing I want to do is I want to show so this under the hood. So, this is actually an actual customer that we were working with. I'm not going to say who it was, but oh, well, actually, this is actually an under the hood. Never mind. I've got a customer scenario coming up in a few minutes. So this is how messages work in within Salesforce. So if you think about if you have an org that has a number of batch Apex processes, for example, within the kernel, there are these worker threads that will prioritize the different orgs and make sure that one org isn't taking over all of the processes, of all the other orgs. And what it'll do is it'll start putting processes on hold. So as you're thinking about the way that you want to handle like a multi-threaded approach to to message processing, rather, if you're thinking about things like platform events or any kind of asynchronous processing, something that you're going to want to keep in mind as an architect is how multi-tenancy works under the hood, and the fact that if you do have a huge number of parallel processes being executed at the same time, some of those are actually going to be put on hold, and they'll end up waiting so that the other orgs have a chance to execute as well. Um, all right, next topic is intentionality. Or aligning with business and technology. Delivering value to your business quickly. Intentionality is one of the things, and this comes back to some of the soft skills we talked about as an architect. So making sure that you've got the right governance structure in place and thinking about a COE, thinking about roadmaps, long and short-term roadmaps, using roadmaps the right way. Putting a set of design standards in place to ensure consistency across all of your implementations, having good documentation, and making sure that your solutions are maintainable over the long term as well. So there are plenty of times that I'm sure we've all seen scenarios where we have built solutions that will work and solve an immediate customer need, but the right team is not in place if somebody needs to go and make an update to something later, or the solution itself is not maintainable because it's so complex that even if you have really talented technical resources, they're going to have a difficult time actually making any updates because it's hard to follow this like kind of spaghetti solution that's cobbled together. That's what we mean when we talk about intentionality. And then building good automation. So the agents themselves are, when we talk about AI, like I said, I'm going to talk about AI a little bit, even though this isn't an AI presentation. It is one of the main things that we're hearing about with Salesforce lately. So if you think about building an agent and there's a flow associated with that agent, for example. Is it really one flow? Is it multiple flows that need to work together? What does your automation strategy actually look like? And are your business processes actually optimized? So the processes that actually drive your automations, thinking through those things first and actually working with your business stakeholders to make sure that the way that they're doing something isn't just oh well, this is the way that we've always done it. Please just build it into the system the way that we want you to. It's more of let's make sure that we're optimizing it, and then whatever we build on top of that will be streamlined as well. How are you handling your data and thinking about, when you're making record updates and that you're not having multiple processes that are overwriting each other's updates, for example. And then how are you handling any errors? So if a process fails, do you have a way to gracefully exit that process without having the entire system stop working or just put a really cryptic message on the screen for the users? And then also making your solution engaging. So, your UI and your UX, are your forms streamlined? The users have the ability to enter just the amount of data that they want to see without having a big cluttered looking screen. And then do you have the right form factors? So thinking about what specific devices you need to use, your system needs to be used on, and making sure that it'll work on all of them and that you've tested it and done the appropriate designs as well. And the Salesforce UI by itself handles a lot of that with Lightning, but if you start making your own custom components or doing a bunch of overly customized different sites that are then calling Salesforce APIs, this is something to think about with your own end-to-end solution. And this was another one. So this is actually a customer that I will not give the information about who it was, but this was a real a real system that we had to go in and address this issue. So this customer had within Salesforce, they had their account object. It had about 14 million account records, It had a field history related list on the account object page layout. They had 8 systems of record that were replicating, fully replacing 14 million records on a nightly basis. And then they had their field history object was a custom object that was showing the related list, and it had about 4 billion records, and the history was being tracked for dozens of fields. And this customer could not figure out why their account, whenever they went to open an account, why it would take so long to open. And then also their batch job was taking forever overnight. What we ended up doing for them was, number one, we took the field history related list off of the page layout and added a button to the account object screen to just bring up the field history if somebody clicked on it. We also changed the 14 million records of like a full refresh every night. We updated the integration pattern to be handle more deltas. And then we went through and made sure that the history was being tracked only for fields that they actually needed to. So that was working with business stakeholders. And as a result, the replication took a lot less time. That was more streamlined. The pages loaded quickly. And then, the other thing that we noticed was we actually started keeping track of how many people were actually clicking the button to see the field history, and it was less than 1%. So the the majority of people, the account record, the account object was taking so long to load because it's trying to load that field history every single time for users that were barely even looking at it. So the end result of this was really happy. The users were really, or the organization was really happy, and the users were really happy with it. And it was some under the hood architectural changes that we made in the background. At the end of the day, the system itself was still doing exactly the same that it was doing, but we fixed their behind the scenes patterns and made things a lot more streamlined for them. And the last couple topics I want to talk about are adaptability. So making sure that your designs evolve over time. These are things like where we talk about resilience. So DevOps and having a good release management strategy so that you can get changes to production in a way that makes sense and eliminates things like merge conflicts, but also that if you do have to address a production issue, you can do it quickly. Having a good solid environment strategy and knowing what environments are being used where and what type of testing and or development is being done in what types of environments. They have a strategy to respond to incidents and prioritize incidents that where a system is actually down versus incidents that might be a little bit lower priority that you can address, take a little bit longer to address. And then continuity planning. So what do you do if your system actually does go down and you need to make sure that your business can continue to operate while your system is not available? So that's something to be thinking about as well, and making sure that plan is in place. And then the last one is composability, which is probably the most abstract concept in an architecture, but also another one that definitely worth being aware of, which is interoperability between all of the different components in your systems, managing your APIs, and having a good solid integration strategy. And then a good packaging strategy. So if you're thinking about DevOps and release management, and you're using something like unlock packages, for example, making sure that you know what's going in those packages, that you know how to deploy those packages, and where they're being deployed to as well. And then another under the hood, this one is just about migrating different changes between environments. So as you think about the way that you want to ensure that the right change is making into production, that testing is being done in the right place. This diagram is actually available on the Salesforce Architects website, and it kind of goes through the idea of using a stable release mechanism. So that could be unlocked packages. It could also be DevOps Center if you want it to be source control repository. So making sure you're using, like a GitHub, for example, and then doing your config development, unit testing in your developer or Scratch orgs, uh, code merge, and then functional testing in like maybe a developer pro sandbox, and then your regression integration testing, and then training in a partial copy, and then performance and scale testing, and then UAT in a full copy sandbox, and then production. You shouldn't really be making any changes other than maybe building reports, but the idea is you're doing a push-pull for those lower environments, and then all of the partial and full copy sandboxes, you're just pulling from the source control and making any changes if they need to be made in the lower environments, and then going back. So the one thing I want to mention is all of these topics are available on the Salesforce Architects website. So you can do a deeper dive into any of them if you take a look at the Salesforce Well Architected framework. There's also some diagramming resources and a few other things. So the Salesforce Architects website is some of the links are being updated to point to other Salesforce resources, and you should be finding a lot of access to a lot of other resources. And the site's also being updated to include patterns and anti-patterns for specifically for a data cloud and Agentforce as well. So those were the main slides that I had. But the one thing that I wanted to do was give anybody a chance. I know that we're all architects here, and since this was or most of us are architects, and I thought one of the things that would be fun is rather than me just talking at you the entire time and presenting slides, would love to do a just an open whiteboarding session. So if anybody has a specific problem that you're trying to solve and you want to talk through it, I would love to do that. We can. I've got a blank Lucid chart up that I can switch over to and share, or we can just kind of riff on some general architecture topics. So if anybody has any thoughts, yeah, let's hear it.
Thank you so much for this presentation, Tom. So one quick thing, this is just out of my recent experience in one of my customer here. The thing is, we have a scenario where the org is very old, like quite 10 years old, and they really want to do some technical depth analysis, like, what all things are being used and not being used. We know we have tools here from Salesforce also, which we can use Apex Guru and all. But is there anything else do you think, out of, well, I'm Googling, I'm checking out a lot of things, but like, is there something out of your experience you can just share, like, can be helpful
Yeah.
to understand the technical, depth in an
Yeah.
bulldog?
I mean, there are a number of, like you said, there's tools available from Salesforce, which are great. But one of the things that you're going to need to do ultimately is, start by taking a look maybe at their the data model for that org. Take a look at all the different profiles, permission sets, permission set groups. I'm guessing if the org is old, you're going to see a lot of data or you're going to see a lot of configuration that's being done in
Yeah.
profiles and not as much on the make an inventory of that. Make an inventory of all the different Apex classes, and then the bigger question there is going to be if they've got a lot of old configuration, a lot of old code, how much of that is still being used today? And I think that's going to be the biggest question that you're going to want to ask. And are they doing this because they want to migrate to a new org, or they just want to clean up what's in their org, their existing org?
But they're not planning to migrate to a new one. They want to continue with the old one itself. And but the challenge, the reason why they came up with is because of lately it's hitting all the governor limits. If they're doing anything, so always hitting SOQL limits, and also that's where they thought, okay, they should come up with something. So yeah, uh, but
Yeah,
I
one of the
was
other
just thinking,
things.
I was just thinking maybe if we have any tool apart from like regular Salesforce tools, like which can help us to find out, some dynamic, uh,
know,
checking.
what I'm thinking of is Elements Cloud. That's
Yep.
Okay.
definitely one of the strongest tools in that area for analyzing your whole org, and to some extent also the data within your org.
Yeah.
But I actually did also build a framework for this myself recently because I found some gaps in the analysis I was looking for, particularly what you just mentioned, Tom, on what is still being used. So analyzing your metadata through your data to see when fields were last filled and uh, not just fill rates, but also looking at fill rate by record type and looking at matching default values and things like that, to really look at the metadata through the perspective of the data, because that actually tells you the real story, like how the system is being used.
Yeah.
But yeah, the reason I built that framework is because I couldn't find anything standard that did the same thing. Like Elements Cloud is a great starting point and it covers a lot, but it doesn't cover everything. So sometimes there's no way around it than to just figure out something, do it yourself. And the tool I built does it with a combination of Apex Describe, calling the tooling API directly through Apex, and with a lot of SQL queries that run from a couple of batch Apex classes. But yeah, and in practice, it can be quite difficult to perform these analyses.
Yeah. I'd love to see a demo of that tool at some point, kid, because
Yeah, it's still in the early stage. I did use it at one client in production so far, like for a real analysis, but still in the very early stages of being a managed package. But I will plan a session around it later to give a demo.
I think that will be great. Yeah. And thank you
yeah,
so much for your recommendations. Okay. Yeah.
yeah, that is awesome. Because yeah, the Salesforce, the standard tools are they only go so far. Like it'll tell you how many custom fields are on each object, but I mean, you could go look at that yourself and figure that out.
Yeah.
It's having the context around what are these actually for, and does anybody still care about them? And those are the questions that you need to really ask.
Yeah.
And I think I saw in the chat, yeah. So Marie mentioned field trip as for specifically for field usage analysis, and then there's somebody else that built a Java tool as well. So yeah, it seems to be ultimately what ends up happening is kind of the like, okay, I've tried all the standard tools. They got me so far. Elements, a tool like that is really useful, but it still doesn't do everything. And then ultimately you end up either, using one that somebody else that wrote or writing your own. So it would actually be cool to see if Kit, if yours is ready to at some point become a managed package, and you can put it up on the App Exchange too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is already a managed package, but it's not on the App Exchange yet, so it's definitely not at that stage yet. But I'm looking to bring it at some point to that App Exchange.
Okay. Thank you so much for the points.
And I can tell you that my most recent project that I worked on, it was more at the enterprise architecture level, but figuring out an org strategy across an entire one of the U.S. states that has literally dozens of different agencies and departments, and they're trying to figure out the which ones can share an org, which ones need their own org, putting together a roadmap for when they go live. It's completely greenfield, so they're just rolling out Salesforce for the first time, and it's been a fun but also challenging project to work on because we're looking at all their legacy systems and thinking about which ones can be retired when, how many capabilities can actually be migrated to Salesforce using standard functionality, and then what we're going to need to build custom. So that's those are kind of some of the things that we've been working on.
It does have to be implementation related. So also when you saw at the topics that Tom covered earlier, you'll find that many of these are not just a practice in how you create your architecture. They're actually part of your architecture capability within the organization. Like it's more of a way of working that you do have to align on also with your business stakeholders and with your development teams, because it
Yeah.
only works if you apply it end to end. Like for instance, you brought up the principle of backups, and then you also have to think of metrics like your RPO and RTO.
Yeah.
But of course, as an architect, it's not up to you to decide that for yourself. Like you have to align that with your business stakeholders. Like what should the recovery points and recovery time objectives be? So it's
Yes.
the whole architecture role is not just something that you apply when you define the architecture itself. It's more of a way of working that you apply in all your architectural activities, including your stakeholder management, your architectural risk management, um,
Yeah.
your process mapping, like the whole end-to-end chain is all following these same principles. So if you have any challenges there, could also be an interesting one to discuss now.
Yeah, it's not a one and done for sure. And the nice thing is some of these foundational architecture concepts that we talk about will actually apply to other systems that aren't Salesforce. So, coming up with a business continuity plan, for example, and thinking about things like your recovery time objective and recovery point objective, the reality is you should be doing that across all of your systems and prioritizing the ones that are in the event of a total failure of your network or whatever, what are the systems that need to be brought back online as quickly as possible, and how much data do you need to make sure that you can restore as quickly as possible to those systems to get back to normal business operations, for example. And if Salesforce is going to very likely be one of them, but what about your ERP system? What about your identity providing, your IDP? What about there you can give a big long list, and the reality is if you're thinking about your architecture the right way, you should be thinking about it across the board, and everything's related, and you should be putting that in place. And it is not just okay, we're going to implement the system. We're going to make sure that the architecture is designed well for this one system at this one time. It needs to be an ongoing thing, and it needs to be an ongoing practice, and it needs to be something that architects are constantly keeping each other up to date on if you've got multiple architects, for example, as well. A view on the latest Informatica deal and impact on Salesforce architecture going forward. That one will be that's an interesting one. So, I mean, at this point, it's still early. We just announced the deal yesterday, obviously, but Informatica has a lot of additional capabilities that like an MDM, for example, and some other enhanced ETL functionality. And Informatica actually also has some of its own AI capabilities that it can do with data that with the systems that are connected. So I don't know specifically what our product team has in mind for that, but it seems like what we're going to end up with is a lot more tools to add to our toolbox going forward. So it'll be interesting to see how that all unfolds for sure. And then current trend in my engagement is really bad security health scores. Yeah. Yeah, that's unfortunately more common than we would like it to be, but that does happen. And I'd be curious what anyone your strategies for addressing really bad security health scores. Um, and I can tell you one of the things that if we think about profiles and permission sets, obviously we should be migrating over to permission sets and permission set groups where possible. And the best way to think about this, and this was actually came from Cheryl Feldman, who is our product manager who oversees those. But if you think of a permission set as a job to be done, so like a specific task that someone needs to complete, and then a permission set group as a persona, so it's got a collection of jobs to be done. At least from that aspect, that's a good way to put together your strategy for how you're going to structure those. And then on top of that, you've also got your sharing rules and all the other different security controls that are available within the platform. But that's one way to rethink your security architecture. And but I think one of the biggest challenges that we see is that there are people with a lot of old configuration in their orgs that really just probably made sense back when things were a lot more simple, and they haven't really taken a step back and reconsidered how they want to make their security model look to really enforce the principle of least privilege. What is the best strategy to manage technical debt? This one will be so. I think the biggest thing to do, the first thing to do is catalog it and then prioritize it. One of the things that I like to say about technical debt too is that we try to avoid it where possible, but it's also sometimes inevitable, especially when you're doing a new implementation that it involves Salesforce, going into an existing landscape where we're trying to retire some systems. Maybe you have to build a temporary integration though, because until the system is retired, you still need to get data from it. And there's a lot of scenarios where you end up creating technical debt that isn't necessarily terrible, but the biggest thing is making sure that you are managing it in the first place and that you have a plan to eliminate it when the time comes. So I think one of the things is, to be aware, whenever you're making any architectural decisions, part of that decision should be to think about if there is going to be any technical debt that gets created as a result of it. And then when you think about your roadmap to make sure whatever the remediation is for that is on the roadmap. And I think one of the other biggest challenges with remediating technical debt is the associated stakeholder management. So a lot of times it is, we know the solution for how we can fix something in the system, but then going to a business stakeholder and trying to get funds for it and saying, hey, look, this is at the end of the day, things are not going to look that much different to the user, but we're making a bunch of fixes on the back end to remove some of this technical debt, and things are just going to be, quote unquote, better. That can be a difficult conversation to have. So making sure that your business stakeholders really understand the importance of eliminating technical debt where possible and managing it and being willing to work with you to include some of those remediations in your roadmap along with whatever new features are being built is crucial as well.
Yeah, one other principle I apply in that area is that everything you don't touch for a while at some point will become technical debt.
Yeah.
You see, and that can apply on various levels. So maybe from a functional level, from a business perspective level, business process level, it can still be relevant. Like maybe your business process has not changed in the last 8 years.
Yes.
But if you have quite a complex process that wasn't something you could implement with out-of-the-box functionality, especially at the time, then it might have been built in Visualforce at the time because that's what you used 8 years ago. Then Lightning came along and you started using Aura. And then at some point LWC came along and you started using LWC. But if it's still in Visualforce, then at least from a implementation perspective, there's pretty much by definition technical debt. But there can also be technical debt and non-compliance from, for instance, security perspective. Like a lot has changed in the last 8 years in terms of security and how you, for instance, protect against things like cross-site scripting, like the session security that Tom discussed earlier. So if you don't take that into account and you just leave things as is for long enough, then at some point it's always technical debt, and maybe not from a functionality perspective, like it's still applicable, it's still functionally it should still do the exact same thing as when it was first built, which I doubt, to be honest, but let's assume that it is. And then still from a technical perspective, like how you implement it, how you solution it, probably still has changed. Another good example is the API versions that you have on your flows and your Apex, for instance. Like if you leave that the same long enough, then at some point you are not just not benefiting from new features that were released in later releases, you also have technical depth in how you do things, like how certain APIs work, what security mechanisms you have available to you. So
Yeah.
also there you should update that. Like recently I had an org that was now 17 years, 4 months old. And there was Apex in there on API version 12, which is actually older than the org itself. So probably some developers that first started on the org either didn't update their IDE settings, or they copied over some code from another org or from a different repository or something, because the oldest code in there was from the winter '06 release from October 2005. But that created all kinds of issues. Like there were, for instance, classes that contained both the test code and the functional code in the same class, which was allowed until API version 28.
Yeah.
And from 2029 onwards, it said like, no, your test methods should actually be in a class that's annotated, that's declared as an is test class. But of course, you don't want to declare your functional class as is test. So that's all had to be separated to update to a new API version. So that's a good example of if you leave it for too long, then at some point it's always technical debt. So quick short answer, a summary to your earlier question, like how to manage technical debt continuously. Like just make it a habit to always manage it as you go. One thing I often tell to developers or to architects that work on something, like if you make some functional changes, then also have a look at the class or the R component or LWC or whatever. Like, is there anything that stands out as, okay, that's really not the way to do it, or at least not anymore? Then fix it right away. You're there already. You're already making changes. Just fix that as well. And that way you also keep it manageable and you don't have to allocate much additional budget to manage your technical debt. Like if you all take care of it in isolation without in tandem doing your functional changes, then it's very hard to sell to the business. If you do it in one go with functional changes, then you can just position it as one piece of work, even though you actually did two. Like you did one enabler story, one really technical story that has no direct business value, business impact, and one functional story. And then you keep both your technical stakeholders, your IT stakeholders, as well as your business stakeholders happy.
Yeah, that is a lot of good points there too. Yeah, one is that with the way the Salesforce platform just evolves over time and the multiple releases per year, to your point, you may have built something 5 years ago that at the time that you were building it, you were 100% following best practices. And that just those best practices are not the best practice anymore. So now you've got that, um, and then to your point, if you're going in and making an update and there's something that's like glaringly not best practices anymore, then let's fix that. And then you have your two user stories, right? You've got one functional and one technical, and then the where it does start to get complicated is when you've got something like like a big collection of old Visual Force pages that are still working. Your business users think that they're fine, but that that there's a better way to be building something like this now. And then that's where you start to get the okay, let's talk about let's have that negotiation on what do we need to do to remediate this, and then what new capabilities can we also be introducing while we're doing it, and then figure something out from there. So but it is true. It is you're never gonna have no technical debt, and just being prepared to always maintain it. And I think one of the other notes too that I've is getting used to the idea that there's going to be technical debt, but you want to minimize the severity and you want to remediate it where possible or when possible, because you could figure it out and put it on your roadmap. Because one of the things that I also see every now and then is during like a solution design phase, people will get so obsessed with having zero technical debt and eliminating all the technical debt from the org, and that it starts to get into analysis paralysis of we're looking at all these different options. Well, this one's going to create technical debt, even though the technical debt is minor. This solution is going to be not ideal, but it won't create any technical debt. It's not ideal for the business, but and then you end up having these debates that you don't always aren't really necessary. It's let's build the ideal solution. If there's technical debt, as long as you're not creating security flaws or anything like that, but if it's something that that you can remediate, and you plan to remediate it, it's be okay with that. That's another thing.
As long as at some point you do actually handle it, otherwise it
Yeah.
piles up and then you get into a different crippling situation where the spaghetti becomes so tangled that the only way to
Yeah.
Untangle it is basically get a big knife.
Right.
And
Yeah,
then
that's the key is
yeah,
you have
and
to actually follow
yeah,
up when putting the plans in place is one thing, and then actually you have to
yeah,
go do it and follow your own plans.
yeah.
So yeah.
But if we start cutting up spaghetti, we make the Italians angry. So better to manage it up front. Um, and another thing that I want to mention earlier, the point came up about not replacing an org, but that might also be a viable option. Like maybe you've seen it once or twice in the release notes or in documentation where it says like that only works for orgs that were created before a certain date, or vice versa, that it only works for orgs that were created after a certain date. And for some cases, you have to contact support to enable something if you have an older or newer org. Basically, with every release, the upgrade is not 100%. Like it's more like 99.5% or something, or maybe 99.9%, but it's not a full 100%. There's always a tiny change that is not fully upgraded with the release compared to getting a new org at that date as the first release you have that org at. And over time that accumulates. Like the org I mentioned, 17 years, 4 months, that is 52 releases.
Yeah.
That's, yeah, if you do 0.995 to the power of 52, then you'll find that there's quite a gap, quite a part that you're missing with all those tiny parts that were missing with each upgrade. So even over time, it can be a viable option to just go in a new org and start fresh, even from that perspective alone. And then if you pile up the actual implementation technical depth, even if it was the best practice at the time, it might no longer be now, then there can definitely be a business case where a new org is the better way to go than to clean up and refactor your existing org.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's one of those trade-off analysis you put together of what is the business actually going to get? Because if you're right, if there's features that are missing because they were only available in orgs created after a certain release or whatever it is, if those are features that your business users can seriously take advantage of, then you need to be having that discussion because it's getting a new org is still no picnic either, compared to it's not like it's easier to take one approach or the other, but you know, what is the level of effort to stand up a new org, migrate all your data and processes and everything into it, and then give the business access to features that they wouldn't have access to in the old org, and at the same time be eliminating a lot of that old technical debt versus just doing a big refactoring effort in the old org. And it's you know lay out, like do a trade-off analysis and lay out the pros and cons of each approach and work on your, have that discussion with your business stakeholders.
I'll see a good question, by the way, from Justina in the chat. So how to tell business to slow down with the new features and that dealing with technical debt is also important. They are chasing the new things and everything is working for them. So almost no resources available for technical debt reduction.
Yeah.
The way I discuss those kind of topics with senior stakeholders, like even up to CXO level stakeholders, is positioning both as value. Like
Yeah.
the business functionality obviously adds direct business value, or maybe second degree business value, but still very tangible, very relatable. It resonates with them because
Yeah.
they get new functionality, which might allow them to operate more efficiently, more effectively, at a lower cost rate. Might be able to give them new products or new services or new product lines or business lines. So that's the easy part. They understand that. But what you want to do to compare the two is position technical depth as negative value, like it's a risk. And for some non-functional requirements and for some architectural principles, that's more difficult than for others. But for security, it can be quite easy to make that understandable for non-technical stakeholders. Like it's been in the news many times over the past few years that large organizations were, for instance, hijacked by ransomware. And I haven't heard any cases where ransomware was applied directly on Salesforce, but maybe comparison cases can be made for other situations that, okay, this situation could apply to Salesforce and it's a risk. Like there's maybe a small chance of occurring, but if it does occur, it might be crippling. It might put the whole organization to a halt for weeks or even months. Like if you're not paying and they're not releasing the data, for instance. Same with backups. If maybe some process went haywire or an admin user accidentally made a mistake, like if there's no backup available, then is that data gone? Well, that data might represent millions or even tens of millions worth of orders or contracts. And that can have, apart from the financial repercussions, all kinds of legal repercussions as well. And apart from the direct business risk, business issue, you also have the reputational damages and the second and third degree repercussions that come after that. So if you phrase your technical debt as non-compliance that results in risks and in turn in issues if those risks manifest themselves, then you can bring net value in two different ways. You can bring it by adding positive business value, so your functional changes, your new features, or you can add net value by reducing negative value, which are your risks that you haven't tackled, like security non-compliance, non-compliance in your backup and restore processes and solutions. And that way it becomes a lot more tangible for the business, and they see the importance much more if you discuss those kind of things in that way.
Yeah, that's a good approach. Another approach that can work in some scenarios, maybe not all of them, but it actually kind of goes back to Kid what you were saying earlier of, so let's say we're about to roll out, or the business is requesting this new feature, and we know it'll take 3 weeks to build it and roll it out. But there's also some technical debt that's kind of like adjacent to whatever that feature is that we could take the time to fix, and then having the conversation with the business that, look, okay, this is, instead of 3 weeks, maybe it's going to take 5, but in the meantime, we're also going to be, fixing a bunch of these other behind the scenes things. And as part of rolling this out, we're going to make the system a lot healthier too. So, thinking through some of those things and just looking for the opportunities to remediate technical debt where you can, especially in an older org that probably has quite a bit of it.
And there are also frameworks where it is a practice where it's part of the methodology. For instance, if you work with SAFe, so the Scaled Agile framework, then there's also let's say a functionality, a method of the whole methodology that says that you can define, you can allocate fixed percentages per sprint and also per planning interval. So the collection of sprints in which you plan if you work with SAFe, for your functional stories and your enablers. So some suggestions in the framework itself is that you do like 80-20 or even 70-30. So 70% of your time you can spend on creating new functional stories, like new direct business value with new features, new functionalities. And the other 20 or 30% you spend on enablers. And those enablers can be, for instance, reduction of your technical debt, but it can also be your architectural runway, that you sort of create foundational elements upfront that support the development of your later functional stories. And that's not always as applicable with Salesforce as it is with some other architectures, because of course Salesforce is already a SaaS, so the whole infrastructure and the application layer are already there. You don't have to worry about that. The database is already there. So most of the foundation is already in place because Salesforce provides it. But there can still be additional frameworks that you put on top of that yourself to support development of further functionality. Like one that you see quite often is, for instance, a trigger framework, that you don't put all the code in your triggers, but that your trigger calls a handler, and the handler implements an interface, or it extends a virtual or an abstract class to provide structure and separation of concern. And then that framework obviously is a prerequisite for building your first triggers and your first trigger handlers. So that's then architectural runway. It's something you build upfront as a foundational element for later functionalities that you want to add on top of it.
Yeah. One other note too, and now this one, before I even mention it, I'm going to say I know this is easier said than done, but it's also when you need to have that conversation with your business users about the importance of remediating technical debt. The other thing to do is make sure that the like IT stakeholders, like at the executive level, are aware of the importance of remediating technical debt as well, so that they can also kind of go to bat for you and empower you to have those conversations. Because the reality is, part of our role as architects is to make sure that our system is healthy and is performant, is scalable, is secure, and all of the different topics that we covered. And as part of that, sometimes we have to push back and say, look, I'm not going to just be an order taker for the business. I am, going to make sure that the system is healthy from an architecture perspective. And like I said, I know those are very well, I guess depending on your organization, but in a lot of cases, those can be very difficult conversations to have. But getting that buy-in from executives, especially on the IT side, is critical as well. Today, we see more and more flow instead of triggers, knowing that flow can be changed directly in production. Isn't it wise to move to triggers? Yeah, what are the type of flows that should be allowed to build from a governance perspective? This is an interesting question because flows used to be so limited with what they could actually do that it was almost like it wasn't a big deal to build one in production because you couldn't really do a lot of damage like deleting records or things. Whereas now you can loop through an entire collection of records and delete all of them accidentally in a flow. And if you build that right in production, you're gonna have some pretty unhappy business users, obviously. Um, Knowing that flows can be changed directly in production, is it wise to move to triggers? I think that has more to do with what resources do you have available to maintain your solutions longer term. So if you have a team of strong Apex developers that are available, then yeah, triggers obviously, you should be thinking about that. But if you have people that are more visual and maybe are more used to using flow, then flow but then what you do is you have to put standards in place about what can or can't be modified in directly in production, and make sure that people, that your security permissions are updated as well.
It can also be tricky sometimes with having admin user in production. Like maybe in some cases you just want one admin, or maybe that's also a bad idea. But let's say two admins that you have a backup. Let's say one gets locked out or is on sick leave for a long time or on holiday, and then an additional one for your CI/CD pipeline. But limiting the amount of admin or semi-admin access, like even if you have like permissions like customized application or offer Apex, those kind of permissions, even if you get them through permission sets instead of through the system admin profile, you are still sort of a partial admin. Like you still have the possibility to make significant changes to the system, and it also might not be easy to revert. So limiting the number of people that have that access in production is a good starting point there. And for your CI/CD pipeline, things like branch permissions and making good use of pull requests so that you cannot accidentally merge your feature branch into the main development branch that later goes into production. Then there's also additional safeguards to avoid accidentally deploying things to production later.
Yeah. Definitely. And the other, you're right. You should have very minimal people with system admin access in production. And I always like to tell people I don't even want system admin access in most production environments, right? If I need it, there's ways to temporarily elevate people's permissions. So if there is some like firefighting that you have to do where it's you're fixing some critical issue for the business, you should do that, but that should be rare. I mean, the reality is, especially with all of the different modern DevOps frameworks, and you should still be able to, even if it's a really like critical hot fix, you should still be able to get it through your pipelines into production in an efficient way without having to go directly make any changes in production. So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, it's usually
and
a separate pipeline for that, like with
yeah,
a, let's say, a hotfix scratch or a sandbox, and then with also a hotfix branch on which
yeah,
you can create your own feature branches. And
yeah,
then for the rest of your pipeline, you get an upstream merge instead of a downstream merge. So you back merge it upstream into your pipeline so that the hotfix um, also moves into all your upstream branches and corresponding environments. So you don't accidentally overwrite your fix later with a new deployment from one of your that originates from one of your feature branches.
yeah. And fair point, not all customers have CI/CD assigned like that, but that still doesn't mean everybody just has admin access in production either, right?
No.
It still means you keep that rare and you keep any changes directly in production to be
Yeah.
uh it has to be an emergency. So
And another
um
thing that helps, in my experience, is running your test code with all deployments,
yeah,
or at least running a relevant selection of the test code also for non-code changes. Like if you make a field mandatory, or if you add a validation rule on it, or you change the field type, which in some cases also allow, then it might break other functionalities like code, but also flows. And back in the day, also your process builders and workflow rules could break. So to avoid that, especially for the Apex code, it's often a best practice to always run your Apex tests, at least the ones relevant for the area you've been working on. So let's say you've been working on opportunity, then you might not want to run also all the tests for case and for context, but it does make sense to run your test losses for opportunity if you add a validation rule on opportunity to make sure that all the code still works. And you can also write test classes for flows. I don't think there's a test framework within flows yet, so there's no equivalent of an Apex test class for flows within flow itself. Like you cannot create a test flow, um, but you can write Apex test classes for your flows, at least your the trigger based ones,
yep,
not for your screen flows, of course,
yeah,
so that you can test whether those still work. Downside is then that you are still writing code even though your solution itself is declarative. But other alternative, if you do have CI/CD, is incorporate UI-based testing framework, like for instance solutions like Tricentis Tosca, or even if you do it in a more manual way with frameworks like Selenium, then you
yeah,
automate it from the front end and test your functionality the same way the user would, like through the actual click path from the user interface, just in an automated way.
yeah, yeah. Um, and then do we think Salesforce should blockchain should loop flows and all critical metadata in production? I mean, ideally, yeah, I'm not sure why it isn't, but uh, that would be ideal. But I think the other thing is there are still ways that you can block them yourself with your own security model as well. Oh, there are the top three skills that an architect needs to be effective. So let me think. So the first one is obviously just going to be the experience with the platform itself. Um, and the actual technical experience. The other is going to be uh, honestly business, like an understanding of what business users are trying to accomplish. Because a lot of times as architects, we end up, we're kind of the go-between between technical users and business users, and then in addition to that, there's just the soft skills of being able to manage stakeholders and knowing how to have difficult conversations, things like that. So those are my three. And then each one of those would have a set of subcategories. So if we want to talk about like the technical part, then from there we could talk about security and understanding reliability and how to make things perform well. But like I said, technical understanding, business knowledge, and then stakeholder management, I think would be my top three. But love to hear if anybody else has any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the same from my perspective. Like the third one would definitely be the soft skills, like being compelling and convincing communicator. Like coming back to the early discussions and the points that Justina made, you don't just want to focus on the functional changes. You do want to have a healthy solution, not just one that has high fat for purpose, but also one that adheres to your architectural principles, that complies with your non-functional requirements, and not just the ones that you came up with yourself, but also regulatory compliance. Like there might be certain laws you have to comply with, either because of the country you're in or because of the industry that you're in. Like if, for instance, in Europe, we discussed the GDPR, but if you have financial data or legal data or medical data, then there's much stricter rules that you have to comply with. Like for instance, if your client is a bank or if organization you work for is a bank. So yeah, to balance that, you have to be really effective to communicate across different stakeholder levels, but also very different stakeholder groups. Like as an architect, you are often the sort of spider in the web where you have to talk to developers, to end users on a business level, to middle managers and directors on a business level, maybe even to CXO stakeholders if you're the lead architect on a very large program. And they all have very different interests, different KPIs on which they are measured, like how well they are performing at the organization. And they speak a different language. Like you, even if you're telling the same story, you have to tell it differently for every group of stakeholders. And that's also where you see differences in how you present your architecture. Like let's say that you are talking to the enterprise architects or to the CIO, then you might want to show an Archimate diagram. But if you are talking to sales developers, then it makes more sense to use the diagram styles that are also available on the architect.sales.com page. That they are familiar with and that they understand. But if you talk to business stakeholders, you don't want to present either of those. You will maybe want to do a PowerPoint deck or a live demo that shows it from an end user perspective, and that presents the story, covering the KPIs and the metrics that they're interested in, and in the vocabulary that they understand it.
Yeah. Diagramming is an interesting topic for me too, because it's basically the way that architects communicate with each other and with stakeholders. But that whole concept of know your audience and understand who you are presenting to is critical for that, because I can even tell you early in my career, I used to try to, every time I would make a diagram, I would try to put everything I possibly could in it, as much information as possible. And then you end up with this like, you know, giant like map of a bunch of tiny little boxes with lines connecting them and text all over the place. And number one, nobody can read that anyway. And number two, a lot of people don't care about most of the stuff that's in that. So to your point, if I'm speaking to some really high level business stakeholders, I probably need a couple boxes with an arrow and a couple logos in them, and maybe some really basic information that just kind of gets the point across. But if I'm showing something to a developer and I need to be talking about how to specifically build an interface and what the integration pattern is that's going to be used and what's going to trigger something to happen here, then I'm going to need a lot more detailed information and going to need to go down to a lower level and those big giant boxes with the logos in them are just not going to be helpful for someone at that level. So you need to be thinking about specifically what are you trying to communicate and who are you trying to communicate it to, and then build your diagram appropriately.
But there also your earlier point comes along, Tom, about composability, which
Yeah.
also covers things like separation of concern and delegation. Like you need a certain level of abstraction in your diagrams, and there it can help to apply different levels. Like one framework I've used in the past is the C4
Yeah.
framework to sort of layer your architecture, that you don't try to cram all detail in one huge diagram with maybe even 300 boxes, but that instead you have one diagram, maybe not just Salesforce, but on the whole system landscape. And then you create a diagram for Salesforce where you only focus on key capabilities, or in case of Salesforce, it might be a useful way to look at clouds, like which clouds are in your core platform. And do you have any non-core platform parts of Salesforce in there, like MuleSoft or Roku or Marketing Cloud? So you put that at level 1, and level 0 was then your system landscape. And then at level 2, you dive into that first level. So you go into the architecture of, for instance, just Sales Cloud, of the architecture of just Service Cloud. And then you show within that, you show the different features. And one level deeper, you show the functions within those features. And at the lowest level, it's more implementation level. So then it would, for instance, be the methods in a class that define a function as part of your feature. So your feature is comprised of multiple classes and maybe some line web components or flows or flexi pages. And that feature consists of multiple functions, and those functions are each a tiny part in that whole solution. Like it can also be a single field, or having the field on a page layout. If you layer that architecture, then you can keep every single diagram much smaller, and you get sort of a black box principle where you don't care about all the detail in lower levels if you are at a higher abstraction level. So if you are talking on that level 1, like considering level 0 to level 4, then you only have to cover the detail of the key capabilities of your clouds you have in the org, and you don't care about any of the features and functions within those capabilities or how they're implemented. So the level of abstraction is a very important tool to keep your diagrams organized and readable. The tricky part, though, can be the organization of it, because it does often become like a sort of three-dimensional matrix of all your different diagrams across all the different layers. Because you have the different layers, but you also have the different architectural domains, for instance, like security architecture, integration architecture, data architecture, the solution architecture around your automation, the sort of UI, UX architecture, like the designs of all your user interface, the business architecture, like the business processes that you're actually trying to solution for. So the tricky part can be organizing all your architecture. But one principle I've also applied there, also coming from my mechanical engineering background, is only defining the architecture that you need. Like let's say you have a cube, then to define that cube, you might actually only need 2 views. Like if you have a top view and a side view, providing the right information, just those two views can already explicitly define that it's a cube. Then you don't need a view of any of the other four sides, let alone any isometric views where you look at it from an angle, for instance, like you look at it from the top front right angle. So same applies with IT architecture. Like sometimes to capture all the information, you don't need 20 diagrams to look at it from every single individual angle. Maybe it can suffice to just have 2 diagrams, and with that, the solution is already fully defined. Like as long as you take away the room for interpretation, if your architecture is only interpretable in one single way, or at least there's a very high probability that it's interpreted in the way that you intend to, then you might not need all the additional viewpoints for your architecture.
Yeah, a good point. And interesting note about C4 too is the Salesforce diagram framework. It's loosely based on C4 in that it has all the layers, but I know C4 is it's a much more robust framework. But yeah, to your point, you could have a level 1 diagram that's, maybe it's a high level system landscape, and then there's a level 2 diagram where you're zooming into the individual like systems or components. And so your level 1 diagram is going to have multiple level 2 diagrams. And then your level 2 diagram is going to have multiple level 3 diagrams because each level, it's like you're zooming in further. So you're getting a more granular view, but also a more narrow view. Um, but you could end up with this big Christmas tree of diagrams. But the thing to ask yourself is, yeah, do you really need all of those diagrams, or do you just need the ones that are specifically going to be relevant to the solution that you're building? And because the other challenge, which you kind of mentioned earlier, is that if you end up then have to go back and change one of those diagrams, those changes could end up cascading. And you
Yeah,
don't want to be
definitely.
spending all your days just updating like 50 diagrams all day. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there you also see some benefits with some enterprise architecture tools. Like for instance, if you work with Archimate, which is a modeling language for enterprise architecture, then tools like, for instance, Archi behave a bit like an IDE, like an integrated development environment for your architecture diagram. So it's actually not just a drawing. It's not just the boxes on your canvas. It actually defines all the elements and relationships. So if you change anything, you can, at least to some extent, automatically have that cascade through your entire architecture. Unfortunately, that is only with the enterprise architecture. So I haven't come across any tool like that for Salesforce that works well. But so in Capgemini, we also have a point of view and sort of framework, coming back to your earlier point of the cascading, that is specifically targeted at agile architecture. So if you work in an agile way, and that you don't want to define all your architecture upfront, and that framework is called just-in-time, just-enough architecture. So you always keep your architectural runway in place, that the development teams are not waiting for the architects to deliver their work, like they have all the information from an architectural perspective that they need to implement the solutions, to deliver the user stories, but it's not over-engineered. So you don't create architectural diagrams upfront if you're not 100% sure that the developer teams need them right now.
That's an interesting approach too, because it is kind of funny that traditionally the way a lot of projects would work is you design all the architecture up front, and then the development, like the build portion, might be agile, but then the developers are still working to this diagram that you built months ago by the time you're a few sprints in. And that's not really as dynamic as the ability to do that kind of like just-in-time architecture that evolves with the as the system evolves and throughout the course of the project. So yeah.
And it also comes back to the earlier point about technical depth. Like technical depth is not just on implementation, it's also on architecture. So maybe you defined some architecture that was months ago that was never actually implemented yet, because maybe the delivery itself was pushed down in priority and ended up further along on the roadmap. So then you might need to also refactor your architecture before it's delivered.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
also to the over engineering, like many architects have a lot of experience in consulting and quite a few also in development, but it doesn't always mean, in fact, it's quite often the opposite, that they're also the best at configuration or the best at development. So yeah, in Dutch we have this saying, schoenmaker blijft bij je leest, which translates as the shoemaker should just focus on making shoes and not do other things. Same applies to architects. So if you design something, don't design it to the lowest level where you completely define the structure of all the Apex classes, for instance, or
Yeah.
exactly how the lighting components should look like. That's where your developers come in. They have that knowledge. They bring that expertise. So
Yeah.
they should still have some freedom. Like you, as architect, you define the guardrails, like what are the constraints that they have to stay within to ensure that the solution still works as a whole. That maybe they're working on a single feature, but if they would exceed those constraints, if they would exceed those guardrails, it might conflict with other features that we implemented earlier, or even future ones that might be on the roadmap but that were already designed. So that's why you have those constraints, but it shouldn't be constraints for the sake of constraints. Like if there's no use in it, then give the developers and the configurators the freedom to implement it in the way they think is best, given their knowledge and their expertise of the best practices
Yeah.
for their skill set.
Yeah. I think the nice thing about that too is it's when you think about your project team, it's just a more scalable approach too, because you're using everybody's full brain power in the right way that it needs to be used. Whereas if you do have an architect that's going all the way down to like, this is individually, you should have this class, it should be structured this way, it should contain this pseudocode, then the developer at that point becomes just an order taker, and they're not actually using the skills that they've developed specifically for the job that they're being asked to do. And the other thing that I always think about it this way is that, I used to be a developer, years ago. I mean, I was like a C++ developer back in the like late 90s. So I'm giving away my age now, but the reality is, could I write, could I create my own Apex classes right now? Yeah, and I'm sure they'd be halfway decent, but it wouldn't be anywhere near as good as somebody who is a developer who is, writing code all day and, studying best practices for coding all day. So I want to give them that freedom because I'm going to guess that whatever they're going to come up with is going to be, down to that level is going to be better than what I would have come up with myself anyway. And that's going to ultimately result in a better solution that we all feel good about. So
And it also comes back to the sort of maybe ethics a bit too strong word, but at least fun. Like if
yeah,
you fully define the architecture really down to implementation level, then you also take out the fun part and the creative
yeah,
part of the configurator, the admin, or the developer role. Like they might get bored in their work. Well, actually, I would imagine they would be if I would fully define the architecture implementation level. So you also might see more attrition that there's more colleagues you have to offboard and onboard, which
yeah,
also hurts your velocity and your cost, and of course the earlier point of the fun, like your employees or your colleagues are not happy with the way of working. So yeah, that's also where things like you have to consider as an architect, that leverage the people you have in your team from your own organization, from Salesforce, from the clients, if you're at a partner, and don't try to do everything yourself, because you will always run out of time. And even if you somehow wouldn't, then you're still not leveraging the full capacity of all people you have available within your team.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And Yeah, and then in addition to that, it's not going to be fun for you as an architect either because you're taking on way more than you need to be taking on. And then you're going to be trying to cram solutions together as fast as you can because you don't have time to really think about just the art, only the architecture part of it creatively either. So yeah, you're going to end up with a solution that's probably going to be a lot more rigid and not what the business really needs, or maybe it is, but it's not, they could have had something a lot better, and you're going to have a lot of unhappy team members too. So
I'll see a question from Marie in the chat. Ideas of how AI tools can help with that. I think looking at the time was probably asked when we were talking about the diagramming. Is that correct?
yeah, that looks like
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, what's your
Uh,
experience there, Tom? Because I have tried to use AI tools also for diagramming, but so far the output is far from great. Like I haven't seen,
yeah.
like for code it works well, and also for things like user stories. But so far the diagramming, not so
No.
much in my experience.
I had a colleague who was really excited to show me, what is it, Mermaid.ai, which is an AI diagramming tool. And I tried to make a diagram, and when I asked it to make a pretty simple diagram, it worked fine, and it was pretty cool. And I said, "Wow, this is cool." And then I tried to use it to build an actual system landscape diagram for like a real world project, and it built something that was like unusable. Like I had to throw it out and just build the diagram myself. So that's about where we're at. I'm sure those tools eventually will improve, but as of the time that we're having this conversation, I haven't found anything that great yet.
Yeah, yeah, same here. And yeah, my experience, many tools, especially the common ones, like at some point, or also tried to ask the Microsoft Copilot for um, for a diagram, and instead of a diagram, it was more like let's say a creative illustration, like some fictional diagram to
Yeah.
use in a PowerPoint, for instance, but more from a yeah, like this should represent the diagram than actually being the diagram itself. So it was completely rubbish. Like it was yeah, completely unrealistic what it was
Yeah.
representing. I haven't seen any good diagramming tools yet that yeah really strongly rely on AI that you can do let's say prompt engineering for your diagrams, that you provide some context. But yeah, I'm sure they will come, but I haven't seen them yet that are really usable for this purpose at this point.
No, unless, like you said, if you're creating some kind of like architecture or something,
Yeah,
then just
exactly. For that it works quite well, but
yeah,
but not
but
the actual architecture.
yeah, exactly.
But you do see strong improvements in many areas. So who knows? A year from now, um, I think it's quite likely that it will be there. And looking at how fast things have gone in the last few years, 2 years from now, I'm pretty sure that it will be very mature already.
Yeah,
Because with,
yeah,
with with codes was the same thing. Like early on with codes, it's if you asked it like a very simple example, like let's say, well maybe not Hello World, but let's say something only a bit more complex than Hello World, then in pretty much all situations it gave something usable. But if you ask for a real life, relatively complex but narrow use case, so you don't ask it for entire feature solution, but let's say one function as part of your feature, but a very complex one, then you already saw large issues. Like the code might not even work at all, or even if it did, there were all kinds of gaps. So let's say only the happy path worked, but if there were all kinds of situations in which your code suddenly broke. And there I've seen that in recent months there have already been very strong improvements that I don't come across those situations that often anymore. Like in
yeah,
many cases, the code is quite decent, quite robust, and it does do the functionality well. It's just that the code structure is sometimes still quite poor. That it tends to generate very long methods, for instance. Same with user stories. So early on, if you defined you gave like a definition of ready. So this is what I want my user stories to look like, the structure of the user story and what elements should be covered for a user story to be implementable, that it's ready for the developers. And then it sometimes gave rubbish, but now if you give that definition of ready and you provide your business context, then in many cases it will come up with a very decent user story that only requires some minimal tweaking. So yeah, hopefully you see the same thing with diagramming in a few months or a year from now. But yeah, so far not so much.
Yeah, I will say that would be pretty sweet if we could just type a prompt that it says what kind of diagram we want, what system should be in it, what components or whatever, and then it just draws it. Because then as an architect, what that does is gives us more time to have the conversations with the stakeholders about what are we actually trying to accomplish. Like let's look for any gotchas or anything like that, and then just going out and physically drawing the diagram is something that you can outsource. And so I think that would be like it doesn't eliminate the need for an architect, but it does help some of the more mundane tasks, help minimize some of that. So it would be pretty cool to see what some of those tools look like a year from now, like you said.
Yeah, don't tell any non-architects though, so we all look very efficient, like they're suddenly super effective.
Right.
I would say, Kid, I think that is efficient though, because there's way more architecting we have to do in managing stakeholders and other higher level, more complex things than diagramming sometimes. I've been playing around with Lucid Charts AI feature as I've been building out user stories and have requirements, but I'm not quite there yet. It's a lot of times just having to revamp the whole thing from scratch because they're just not advanced yet.
Yeah, exactly. Like you even see it on the screen right now, the generated with AI. I also played around with the lucid chart, but also there, it's sometimes look nice, but it's quite often complete nonsense what it says. Like it's more useful for maybe some architecture. Like it does have to be real as long as it's sort of represents something that could be real. But yeah, for actual architecture, it still needs some time.
Yeah, definitely.
But who knows? You saw huge steps with the different versions of various large LLMs, and also with the agentic approach, like using generative AI through agents. And I also started doing that manually in some way. Like I remember last year before Dreamforce, there was this call for partners, very long session. I think it was like 3 or even 4 hours. That we did a deep dive on Agentforce and agentic AI, and I hadn't seen that much agentic AI yet up until that point. So I thought at the time it was very interesting to see how Agentforce uses LLMs under the hood through this agentic approach. And I started to construct my own prompts, the ones I write manually, in a similar way, just much shorter, because like under the hood, Agentforce might send prompts to the LLM that are hundreds or maybe even a few thousand lines long in some situations. But with my own prompts, I did move from the very simple single line prompts and then having to iterate a dozen or even 2 dozen times to finally get something that I want and that I need, to writing much more elaborate prompts that were maybe somewhere between 20 and 50 lines long to provide a much more context, but also set the guardrails of, like for instance, when discussing user story example I mentioned earlier, that you don't just say, I want to use a story for this, but that you also provide the definition of ready to provide sort of guardrails for what the output format should look like. Then you get much better results and also much faster. Then you might just need to iterate twice, 3 times instead of a couple dozen times. So yeah, you also see a lot of improvements there. That if you provide more constraints and more context, that it also understands much better how it should interpret and process your prompt.
Yeah, you're less likely to get hallucinations and things too when the more specific you are. So
Yeah.
it's almost like it's almost like asking like like a teenager to do something for you, and it's like do
Yeah.
this exactly like this, and here's your steps, and here's what you should be thinking about while you're doing it, and
Yeah.
then
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, I mean, it was great to see Ryan. We actually did. I mean, we had 2 hours and we're at an hour and 50, almost an hour and 50 minutes here. So
Yeah.
this was a great discussion and great session. And looks like saw a couple people had to drop off early, but it looks like most people are stayed on. So you all found this valuable as well.
Otherwise, I can also give a very quick sneak peek into that solution I
Yeah.
built. I just cleaned up some data in the meantime to
Sure.
not show any details that I cannot share. What I built is a solution that's leveraging two custom objects, object analysis and field analysis. It works through a couple of batch Apex classes, and when constructing those batch Apex classes, you provide a list of the API names of the objects you want to analyze. So in this case, this is the analysis of the account object. And then, as mentioned earlier, it will leverage the tooling API, Apex Describe, and various SOQL queries to analyze the objects and the fields within the object. So there's some object metadata, like this field is the name field is used for the API name, but there's also the ID if it's a custom object, like for standard objects, the reference used under the hood by the system is just the API name itself, but custom objects also have an ID and metadata. Same for custom fields. And if it's a custom object, you can also see when the object itself was created in the implementation and when it was last modified and by whom. Then there are some metrics for when you last ran the framework, like when you last ran these analyses. Some properties, like is it a standard or custom objects, and how many standard and custom fields do you have there. If you have a description defined, it also shows that, and whether it's a managed package or a custom setting, which under the hood also looks like a custom object, like it's shows in the same way, unlike, for instance, custom metadata, which has the MDT suffix. Custom settings are also __C. So that's this is to separate those, where the object is queryable and creatable. If not, then it will eliminate some of the analyses because, for instance, if it's not queryable, then it makes no sense to try to run any SOQL queries on it because they would all fail. So then the framework only does what actually works for that object. Then there's some analysis on the data volumes. So on the layout, it shows last 3 months, 6 months, year, and last 5 years. But under the hood, there's also years for fields for 2, 3, 4 years, and 6 until 10 years. And those combined with the first creation date of the first records and the total record counts today will also be used for data volume projections. So here I implemented some curve fitting algorithms, one for linear, one for quadratic, and one for exponential growth, and then tries to fit all three models on the historic data growth based on these fields and the ones that are not in the layout. And then with a fourth algorithm determines which of the three curve types has the best fit. And then based on that one, so in this case, you see that the quadratic model has the best fit. It will do some projections on what the expected record volume is 1 year, 3 years, and 5 years from now, and also the storage requirements in gigabytes. And it also provides the details of the analysis itself. So for each of the curve types, it provides the formula with then the results of the curve fitting process and T0 date to determine your delta time. So your DT is basically the date of today minus the date T0. Then again, the projections based on that curve type. So in these fields that are dedicated, it only shows the best fitting curve, but it also shows the results in this long text field for all curve types. And then there are some additional metrics to indicate the accuracy of the fit. So in this case, it was a very accurate one because I see that the relative error is less than 0.5%. So this model predicts the historic growth to an average accuracy of less than 0.5% deviation. So it does that for the three curve types. Then there's some details on the latest record changes. So when was the last record created within that object, but also modified both by modified dates and system mod stamp. I had some interesting findings here because like you have the audit field permission that when you do a data migration, you can set the created date and the last modified date in your for your data migration if you want to copy it over from a different platform, which I thought was the only way to have deviations between your last modified date and your system mod stamp. But I actually found there were other situations from records that originated from within Sales itself that still had very large deviations between system mod stamp and last modified date. And I think it had to do with things like sharing recalculations and maybe things like roll-up summaries. Couldn't really pinpoint the exact reason, but yeah, I had some objects where I saw deviations of even 5 years, like that the last modified date was 5 years older than the latest system mod stamp. So I decided to just include them both, just in case. Then it also analyzes the data and ownership queues. So ownership queue is done on object level. The data queues, it only shows the aggregate here, which is this one and this one, because that one is done on the field level. So it's like one level lower where you can find those analysis results. Then this is also an aggregate. So these are all roll-up summaries that aggregate the number of fields that have at least one reference of a certain type. So we saw earlier that we have 57 standard fields and 435 custom fields on account. And then out of all those, 109 are referenced in a definition of another custom field, which can, for instance, be a formula field, but it can also be that you defined a formula for the default value and that you reference a different field there. And then it also creates a relationship between two fields where you have a dependency. Same with Apex. So there are apparently 157 fields that have at least one reference in Apex in the account object. And then it does the same on object level. So it also checks for all references of the object itself in things like Apex clauses, triggers, Visual Force, Aura, LWC, flows, and then it lists those over here. And this is, it's not a very pretty framework yet, so it's just 2 objects and a lot of Apex code. So I didn't put that much effort yet in the UI. Also because I mostly build it for exportability. So I just queried the results of this analysis and export it to Excel. Did the rest of my analysis there and actually converted it into CSV files with the structure of Jira stories and Jira epics. So I could directly import it into Jira in a very efficient way as stories and epics for any refactoring. And then does the same thing on the field level. So you have a custom fields where you can also, as mentioned, see then when the field was created and by whom, and what the ID of the custom field definition itself is. Some properties of the field itself. The latest changes are the same principle as an account level, as an object level, but now it checks when was the last record created that had this field filled in. And the same again for update and system mod stamp. The fill count, fill rates, and the opposite as no count and null rates. If it's a Boolean, it also checks the true count, false count, and the ratio between those. And these you also found earlier in Field Trip and also in Elements Cloud, but what I didn't find in any other tool so far is default value analysis. So it also checks, is there a default value? Unfortunately, it only works for static default values, not for default formulas, because it's using dynamic SOQL, which you cannot evaluate the default value formulas in. But at least for static default values, it can check how often is it equal to the default. So in this case, the fill rate is also quite poor. But in this org, I also saw examples where the fill rates look fine, like it was like, let's say 93%. But then just like this one, the default rate was also very high. So yeah, if you look at the number of records that don't match the default value, it's almost zero, and then the field might still not be applicable anymore. Like you might as well delete it because it doesn't really add any value anymore. And it also checks when the last record was created and updated for a non-default value. So that also gives you an indication, like if all the recent records match the default value and the last non-default value was 3 years ago, then it gives you even more reason to maybe even delete that field or at least remove it from the layout. Then the SQ analysis, so it's basically checking if there are any parents, if it's a relationship field, that have more than 10,000 child records. And then all the field references. Now this one's a bit boring because only it's referenced in 2 layouts, but there were some fields that were referenced in tons of Apex clauses and Visualforce and Aura components. And where for me the real value was is with these checkboxes, it's very easy to also filter in Excel, for instance. And then it was quite easy for me to identify certain functionality blocks where almost all the objects in that functionality block and all the codes and all the Apex code and all the front end code, like which was mostly Visualforce and some Aura, was all not applicable anymore. So we didn't even have to consider refactoring it. We could just throw it all out. We could just delete it. And yeah, that can also help you a lot with your cleanup. And yeah, this is why I built like this. So it helps you look at your metadata, but through the perspective of your data, so that you can really look at how is your org actually being used also today, and both historically, but also how it is used today, to determine what is still applicable, like what do you want to keep as is, what do you want to refactor, and which part can you just delete altogether, which in this case was a lot. Like in just a couple of weeks, I deleted, I think, 48 custom objects from the org. Were about 100 Visualforce pages and same number roughly of Apex classes.
Wow.
It was quite a big cleanup in a very short time frame.
Yeah. Nice. Very cool. That's and you said this is it's a managed package, so you can, I mean, right now you can install it in any org that you're working with.
Yeah.
Yeah. That is that is hugely useful. Yeah, I'd love to see at some point have this see this be available publicly, because this is super useful. And even in the other one, there's some of the stuff you showed earlier, there's some great insights, like the rate of growth and everything. So if something hasn't been
Yeah, these ones you mean. Yeah.
yeah. Something hasn't, there's been no records created in X number of years and the rate of growth is almost zero, then, that's another thing of like, is anybody really using this anymore type question you could be asking. So, yeah.
I also saw some interesting cases, like it says here, quadratic. So it's basically a parable. And of course, you can look at different parts of the parable, but I have seen situations where the growth had been declining for quite a few years, and in a very predictable way. So the curve that was predicted, that was fitted by the framework, matched the historic growth very accurately. And then looking at the curve for later dates, you saw a decline in data, because like looking at like the curve, like if it's parable, like it can go up and at some point it will go down if the A is negative to the one before the multiplier of the quadratic part. So you saw there that the model was predicting that 3 years from now you would reach your peak, and the data 5 years from now was actually similar to the data volume roughly today, and that after that was even declining further. So that might also, like, for some situations, give really interesting results. That especially if the curve that was projected very accurately matches the historic growth, then still an assumption, still an extrapolation, but there might be truth to it. Like, it might be that it's no longer applicable a few years from now, and that you actually see a decline instead of an increase.
Yeah, I can see if you think, like you said, if something is on like a steady decline, or if you can calculate that it will. I can think of a few use cases for that, where just some process change, some people are still following the old process, and slowly but surely, as those groups get onboarded to whatever the new one is, you see a decline over time. So yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't have it in this data set. Like, this is actually the results from a real production analysis that I've anonymized, so I removed all the sensitive data. So for instance, you see that this user is just John Doe at example.com, but it was from an actual production analysis. But this one was from an earlier version that didn't have the analysis per record type yet. But basically, it can do this on the whole object for both the object itself and all fields within the object, but also per record type. So you can also see the fill rates and the matching default rates per record type within an object. So for some objects, we had 23 record types, and you could see that some record types were no longer in use, or where the use was strongly declining. But also for certain fields, that some fields didn't look applicable if you analyze them on the whole object level, but they were very much still applicable for one of the record types, which was quite a niche situation, but still a valid use case. So it like, that record type was simply not used that much. So the overall fill rate was low, but the fill rate within that single record type was very high. That might still be 80%, even though the whole on object level the fill rate was less than 1%. So that's that analysis really added a lot of value when I added it on record type as well, especially for objects that have more than 5 record types. That can make a huge difference in how you should interpret the results.
Yeah, definitely.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you, Kit, all the participants as well. Bye, guys. Thank you.
Hey,
Yeah, thanks again, Tom. Thanks for joining
Thank
us
you,
and
yes.
sharing all your wisdom. And
great conversation.
definitely. And talk to you soon.
Yeah,
All
bye.
right, bye everyone.